My name is Nils Güttler. I'm an assistant professor for the history of science at the University of Vienna. During the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about the shared history of the environmental sciences and political activism. By the end of this video, you will have learned about some of the historical roots of the current climate protests, and you will have an idea of how science and political activism have historically interacted with each other. What you see here is a quote from a newsletter of a local citizens' initiative in Frankfurt, West Germany, published in the summer of 1981. Two activists, both of them students at the University of Frankfurt, are desperately searching, as they put it, for all sorts of environmental scientists. With their help, the activists hope to learn more about a jet fuel accident at Frankfurt Airport. In the newsletter, they were also looking for translators. Most scientific papers on that topic, they write, are in English. Does anybody know people like this? They ask, meaning the scientists, and they give their phone numbers. The two activists were part of the so-called One Way West movement, one of the most important green protest movements of the 1980s in Western Europe. It was also a key moment for the foundation of a Green Party in West Germany. From a history of science perspective, social movements of that time, such as the One Way West, were deeply engaged in the production and circulation of environmental knowledge. Activists campaigning against major infrastructure projects, such as airports and nuclear power plants, began to produce environmental knowledge themselves, for instance, by carrying out their own measurements on water and soil pollution. You can think of it as an activist version of citizen science. However, not only lay people, many academics too joined these movements to share their knowledge with the broader public. In doing so, they participated on a broader phenomenon at the intersection of science and political activism that by 1980 featured under the name of Gegenwissen, in English counter science or radical science. Many environmental scientists who started their careers in the 1970s and 80s had their background exactly in this alternative milieu of knowledge production. Take, for example, the Öko-Institut in the city of Freiburg in southwestern of Germany. Today, it's one of the leading non-university research institutes for environmental sciences in the German-speaking world. It was founded as a protest research institute against the construction of a nuclear power plant. All these examples from the 1980s show that, from a historical perspective, we should be careful not to view science and political activism as strict opposites. In retrospect, large parts of the radical science or Gegenwissen movement of the 1980s did in fact produce solid knowledge, for instance, on the industrial pollution of air, rivers and soil. This goes, by the way, not only for ecology and the environmental sciences. Just take, for instance, the feminist health movement of that period. Much of it is today mainstream science. However, it is also important not to historically blur the boundaries and the lines between science and activism in general, or to think of them as essentially being the same. They certainly weren't. Already back then, the scientific community and the public was deeply divided over the question to what extent scientists were compromising their professional values, such as objectivity or neutrality, when they became politically involved. This was particularly true for the highly contested research field of ecology. These debates are very similar to today's political battles over climate science. Yet it's also important to note that much of the environmental sciences then and now had no explicit political agenda. Many of them were even linked directly to the main opponents of the social movements of that time, the state and the military, or as activists then called it, the military-industrial complex. Today we know that much of the research in the environmental sciences after the Second World War was financed by the state and the military. Take ecosystem theory as an example. One very highly influential research project of the late 1940s was the so-called Bikini Project. Biologists, officially commissioned by the US military, were investigating the ecological effects of the atomic bomb testing in the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. They searched, for instance, for the residues of nuclear radiation in fish. Our current understanding of ecosystems is very much influenced by these geopolitical contexts. In my view, these examples show two things very clearly. First, history reveals that environmental sciences and activism have not been strict opposites for quite a while, but have been in an often productive dialogue with each other. What is more, not just since Fridays for Future, has the interaction of science and activism led to fierce discussions about the neutrality of science. For me as a historian, it is more interesting to closely study how this very idea that science is neutral has changed over time and how the boundaries between science and activism have shifted, rather than taking these boundaries for granted. At the same time, and secondly, these examples allow us to make a step back from the highly emotionalized debates of our present and ask where this knowledge actually comes from. Where was it actually produced? It was clearly not just academia. This is why many historians, including myself, claim that we should view the history of the environmental sciences as part of the history of large infrastructures, such as Frankfurt Airport. Much of what we know about the environment today has emerged as a result of the construction, maintenance, but also of political protest against infrastructure projects, nuclear power plants, landfills, highways, and so on. In this sense, the environmental sciences have historically emerged as the sciences of infrastructure. I would like to end my presentation with a quote from Greta Thunberg. In September 2019, she addressed the members of the US Congress with the following words: "I don't want you to listen to me, I want you to listen to the scientists." What I find interesting about this quote is that Thunberg has a very clear image of what this science is. The more you delve into the history, I think, this picture gets fuzzy and indeed complicated. What we clearly can see, however, is that it is a kind of science that has only partially developed at universities, but rather strongly in interaction with society, with activists, the military, state administrations, and so on. Learning more about its history may also allow us to rethink the political dimension of this knowledge in the present and future.